Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll discuss the legislature's priorities for the session. You can join our discussion by calling us at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by Gillian McGoldrick from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Gillian, you write about Governor Shapiro's efforts to work on a bipartisan basis. What were some of the early priorities that he's broached?
Yeah, he has made a lot of bipartisan promises that he will be working across the aisle on issues that are not traditionally Democratic, on issues that are not totally for just Republicans either. He still is a strong Democrat. Some of those issues include one of the Republican issues is a school voucher program that he pursued this past year that was unsuccessful, but it's one that he tried for. Where he's really shined, though, has not been so much on his bipartisanship, though that has been significant. He has done a lot of work with executive orders, and that includes I-95, the reopening of the collapsed portion of I-95 in June. He got a lot of national attention for that. And he reopened it, the highway within 12 days, a very significant accomplishment. There are a number of other bipartisan issues, though, that he still is working on or was able to tie up loose ends at the end of the legislative year last year.
Now, you mentioned school vouchers. The past scholarship program, which has often been compared akin to vouchers, was blamed as being part of the holdup for the budget impasse last year. Do you think the governor has learned anything or will have a different approach as he negotiates the budget for this forthcoming year?
Yeah, I talked with him about this about 2 weeks ago, and he said that he definitely still plans to pursue it. He has learned a lot about working in the nation's only divided legislature, but he will be pursuing it again. There wasn't any specific lesson learned other than that there's more work to be done between Democrats and Republicans in the legislature, and he will be negotiating on behalf of himself rather than on behalf of House Democrats.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you anticipate the governor will face this year, requiring him to work with all four caucuses?
Yeah, the vouchers will be one of them, or a scholarship program of some kind for sending students in low-income districts to private schools. That will be one of the big ones. But the major one is the Commonwealth Court ruling from last year that's ruled Pennsylvania school funding system as unconstitutional. He has his budget address here in a couple of weeks on February 6th, and in that he will be proposing a new way to fund our school system. The Basic Education Funding Commission, which has been tasked with sort of laying the groundwork of what Pennsylvania's school funding system would look like if it were adequately and equitably funded, just came out with their report about last week or 2 weeks ago, and that proposed about $5.4 billion, in total $9 billion, to fully fund and improve Pennsylvania's education system.
You note that the governor's approval rating is roughly around 59%, according to the latest January Quinnipiac University poll. What do you think is the key to his public approval?
Yeah, he definitely has. I think that in the poll, there's a quote in there that any Pennsylvania politician would love to have his approval ratings, especially President Joe Biden, whose approval ratings are down around 40% in Pennsylvania. The key to that, though, is his promise to be bipartisan. He's out in front on a lot of issues. Particularly, he was out in front against challenging the Penn president when there was after she appeared before Congress and made some anti-Semitic comments about genocide, etc. And he was challenging the university publicly, nationally. Then also he obviously I-95 was a big one for him. And he's very good at coming out in front of issues that might not be entirely Democratic or Republican, but are widely favored by the public.
You had mentioned that the governor will be making his budget address in less than 3 weeks. What initiatives do you anticipate the governor will push in this budget?
Yeah, I think that he will, maybe not in the budget, but I know that there will be an approach of some kind for some sort of voucher scholarship program. Um, that will be one of them, but he'll also be pushing for a major increase in education funding. I think that we'll see him try to grow on some of his legislative wins from last year, including maybe putting more money into school facilities repairs, or also growing the amount of money the state puts towards indigent defense. Pennsylvania put in its first $7.5 million. For the first time, we're one of only 2 states that didn't pay anything toward its public defender's offices. So I expect him to do that as well. I think he'll be just growing on a lot of his plans, but also we'll see some new initiatives too.
We've been speaking with Gillian McGoldrick of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The PCN Capitol Preview returns after this short break. Welcome back. Our guests are Mike Manzo of Triad Strategies and Sam Chen of the Liddell Group. Sam, we'll start with you. Governor Josh Shapiro is expected to present his budget address on February 6th. What do you anticipate will be his big priorities this year?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. And Mike, it's great to be with you. No better way to start a Monday morning with these 2 rock stars. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. I think the governor's budget address probably is one of those most anticipated things. And in our state, unlike at the federal legislature, we're constitutionally required to pass a budget. One of the things I think we're going to have to see either in the budget address or the legislature take it up separately is this idea of school funding. And I think that's probably going to be what drives a lot of at least this early session that coming down from the court case in Pennsylvania. So that's a requirement. That's not something that they can just kind of kick around and kick down the road. So I expect to see that. You may see there's a lot of conversation about whether the legislature is going to take up the RGGI situation, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. The governor's appealing that decision, this Commonwealth Court decision, but there is conversation about whether the legislature needs to be the one that takes it up. I think the other thing that we can expect to see is an attempt at another bipartisan budget. His first budget address was very well received by Republicans. I mean, obviously, there are things that Republicans wouldn't prefer, but understanding that there's a Democrat governor, they were pretty satisfied with a lot of the things that he put in the budget. Certainly, a lot of Republicans said this was a great improvement on the past Wolf budgets. It seemed like he was trying to work with both chambers. And he said that so much in his budget address that he has to get something that can pass both these chambers, one controlled by the Democrats, one controlled by the Republicans. So I think we can expect to see some at least attempts at bipartisan budget items and trying to get things that the legislatures, both legislatures, can move together on.
Mike, your thoughts? Anything else?
Yeah, thanks. And it's good to see you as well, Sam. Great way to spend the morning on Monday. I agree with you. I think the overriding theme will be school funding. Obviously, they don't have much of a choice anymore. The courts have ruled. And in fact, the group that originally brought the lawsuit against the Commonwealth has already sort of sent that shot across the bow saying, if you don't do this and we don't see at least $2 billion more in spending, we're going to just take you back to court. So I think everyone's on notice, and I agree, Sam. I think the thing that I saw last year with the Shapiro budget is, despite all the partisan sniping that went along about vouchers throughout the year, Shapiro didn't hit any grand slam home runs, but he hit a lot of singles and doubles. He got significant investments in places that were important to his core constituency, but at the same time was able to engage Republicans in some of their priorities. So I expect more of the same. He's signaled he's going to do a significant investment in public safety, which I think will be well received by the Republican Party. Outside of school funding, I think you're right, Sam. RGGI sort of looms over all of this, but I think it sets up well for somebody like Shapiro. The governor was there when the legislature passed the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Act, which hasn't been updated since its passage in 2005 or 2006. And this gives him an opportunity, I think, to pivot from RGGI into a real discussion about how we update the AEPS to incentivize more use of alternative forms of energy in Pennsylvania. So expect a lot more singles and doubles out of Shapiro this year.
What do you think the Republican caucuses want to see come out of this budget?
Well, I think they want to see Shapiro hold the line on spending. The cost drivers of this budget are no different than they have been for the past 30 years. It's going to be, the DHS budget will continue to be pushed forward and up. They've kind of gotten their hands around the corrections budget. So they're going to look for, reasonable amounts of spending. Nothing to dip into the rainy day fund that they've assiduously been socking away. And they'll have that discussion about school funding, and they'll do their best to pivot from how much for public schools to, hey, can we start to talk about school vouchers for, underperforming kids, underperforming districts. So nothing really new under the sun, but just sort of a restatement of where they've been historically.
Sam, anything you'd like to add on the Republican priority side?
I think I think Mike kind of hit on the head. I think the other thing is you're going to see a lot of Republicans push for small business. NFIB is probably going to be leading the charge on that one. But that's something where there's been a lot of common ground with the governor. And I think especially in the election year, I think it's important to remember that this is an election year where they're passing the budget. So you're going to have a lot of representatives and senators trying to take something back to their district. So I expect to see Republicans push on those initiatives that they've been telling their districts they're working on and trying to find a place where they think that Governor Shapiro will work with them. They can push on that. They can come back to their district and say, hey, I got something done with a Democrat governor. So I think you're going to see a lot of those initiatives. I think small business is going to be a big focus for the Republicans in this budget.
A reminder to our viewers, we'd love you to join our conversation. You can call us toll-free at 1-877-PA65001 or text us at 717-219-4001. Our first text question comes in today from Ethan from Carlisle. He writes, I've seen recent legislation that has moved in the House to allow independents to participate in Pennsylvania's primaries, but I haven't seen anything in the Senate. Would you share your opinion on open primary legislation and how to move it forward in the Senate?
Sure, I can take that one. I think it's he's speaking about Representative Scott Conklin doing the work over there in the State Government Committee to move Jared Solomon's bill for open primaries. Listen, open primaries are something that happens in 42 other states. And, I think for most Pennsylvanians, it's a question of when, not if. It's gotten to the point now where if you look at recent statistics from Governor Shapiro's motor voter initiative, 40% of the people who are newly registered in Pennsylvania are registering as independents. Younger people, across every demographic, you're seeing more and more independents. And the fact that they're paying tax money to put on primary elections and forbidden from participating in it is really a wrong that the legislature needs to correct this year. There is a Senate bill. Senator Dan Laughlin is the prime sponsor. So there is a Republican senator from Erie who's the prime sponsor. And it's just going to be a question of when the Republican leadership in the Senate wants to make that a priority.
Do either of the parties benefit from having an open primary?
I think that it's probably... it depends a lot. Independents, they tend to move, they're a little bit more moderate in their views. There's a lot of veterans, 1 out of every 2 veterans returning veterans are independents. So they tend to track more moderate. So I think it's just the party that tries to take advantage of that discussion from sort of the political middle, the fight between the 40-yard lines and not necessarily, the far right or far left.
Since this is an election year, a lot of attention on the anticipation that there'll be higher turnout this year. Is there any expectation that the legislature will take up other election-related bills that have been out there? In particular, I know county officials were calling for the ability to prepare to count in advance. Any thoughts on whether any of that stuff will move this year?
I think that there's going to be a lot of election bills that are proposed. The question is how many of those come to a vote. And so I think Republicans are going to run what they call election integrity bills. I think Democrats are going to run ballot access bills. And one of the big ones that you just brought up, this idea that can we pre-canvass? Can we start counting mail-in ballots earlier? Is that something that the counties have said that that'll be a huge help to them? I think you're going to see that kind of legislation in all those categories come up. The question is whether there's going to be enough votes in an election season to get it done. I think this is probably a place where people are going to be a little bit more partisan on a lot of these issues because they are up for re-election. And so if you're in one of those swing districts, if you're a Republican that's in a slightly Democrat district or vice versa, this may be a place to look for compromise. But I think most of our reps are in districts that are somewhat safe. And so there's not really a lot of room to cross the line and kind of get a compromise bill in an election year. I'm not sure we're going to see a lot of movement on that. I think odd years maybe we might see more movement in the odd year, but I don't know that we're going to see a ton of movement. Certainly nothing that's a kind of a home run hit in this cycle.
In the past, House and Senate Republicans have been calling for voter ID. Can you talk a little bit about what it is and why this has been such a controversial issue?
I think it's been a controversial issue. A lot of states have voter ID, but by and large, the Democratic Party has been, reticent to sort of get behind voter ID because misapplied, it turns into a voter suppression tool. There's a lot of elderly Pennsylvanians, a lot of people of color who don't have driver's licenses. So I think if there were an accommodation, and even Governor Wolf said he was open to the idea, and as did Governor Shapiro, if you could find a way to make sure these folks aren't disenfranchised who don't have IDs, that I think that's a place there could be a compromise. But I do agree with Sam. I don't see anything happening before the primary, certainly. I think post-primary, between then and the end of the year, you might see something happen on election reform writ large. But I think what happens at the end of the day is it's a big omnibus package. It's everything everyone can agree to rolled into one election code bill, much like Act 77 when Wolf was governor and they did voter ID. They did, the elimination of straight party balloting. There was a bunch of different things they rolled into one. So I think if and when something happens on election reform, it happens post-primary and it happens in one big agreed-to package.
Let's head to the phones now. John is calling from Northampton County. Go ahead, John.
Hi, yeah. I would like to ask a question about the funding education. You have districts like Allentown here, where I live, that are struggling. Okay, so can I give you an idea how to do this? When you have a district that's struggling like Allentown and Philadelphia, go there and find out what the problem is with those districts. Are there too many immigrant students? A language problem? Is the superintendent getting paid too much and not doing his job? Okay? And then when you go there with a notebook, a brain in your head, a notebook in your hand, and a pen. Leave the checkbook in Harrisburg. When you find out what the problem is with the district, and you can fix it without a check, fine. If you can't, then you write the check. And when you hand it to them, you stay there and make sure it's spent correctly. Philadelphia has a structure problem with their schools. That's okay. That's fine. Allentown has a problem with the disruption, violence in the school district. For a city like Allentown, that's ridiculous. That's how it should be done. And if you have a suburban school that's crying about not having a swimming pool as big as the other school district on the other side, that doesn't require a checkbook. I'm not saying you have to discriminate, but spend the money where it's needed, not where it's not needed. Bye.
Any comments on John's call?
I think largely, and I thank you, John, for your call. I think we allow our school districts, obviously to elect boards that are in charge of, setting funding priorities. The legislature has by and large done a pretty good job in years past of sort of recognizing that not all districts are created equal, and doing what, in past years called level up funding to help some of the poor districts that don't have the tax base. But I think that's the biggest problem is you've got 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. Some of them have very robust tax bases, and some of them can do a great job in supporting their students, whereas some just don't have the resources. So it's finding that balance between the two, and it's a constant struggle when you're dealing with 500 school districts.
Sam, at the beginning of the program, you referenced the past scholarships, which are often compared to as school vouchers. Do you anticipate that this will come up again in the budget negotiations this year?
I do. I think this is one that has been controversial because Governor Shapiro signaled that he would support something like this, much to the cheer from Republicans, and obviously got cut out of the final budget. And so I expect Republicans see an opportunity that they're going to push for it. And the other situation with what we're calling vouchers here and the idea of school choice is that it's not as partisan as a lot of times I think political professionals think it is. And, you travel the state and you travel to some low income areas, you've got a lot of registered Democrats registered Democrat voters who support something like school choice because it gives their children an opportunity to go to a better school than the one where they're assigned by zip code. So the electorate is not as partisan split on this issue as sometimes political professionals are. I think you see Democrats from those regions. They see that. That's why you'll see Democrats who support this idea. The governor has been friendly to it. I think the question, again, comes back to, can you get something like this through both chambers? And then the same thing with what we talked about earlier with the idea of voter ID. The idea is there, but how do you do it pragmatically? And that's an issue that if you go across America, you look at different states and how they do school choice and vouchers, it's different from state to state. And what works in one state may not work in Pennsylvania. And so I think the practical question, how we're going to pragmatically push this forward, is probably the biggest challenge on the issue. But I absolutely expect it to come up again.
Mike, can you talk a little bit about the environment we're in right now? So the Basic Education Funding Commission just released their report earlier this month. They're calling for more funding. And then there's that Commonwealth Court decision from last year that also said that public schools have been underfunded. How does that fit in, or how influential are those factors in what actually happens in the budget?
Well, I think it's going to be the question of this entire budget. Is going to be how much and how is it going to be allocated. I mean, the report itself says that we're underfunding Pennsylvania schools by $5.4 billion. That's quite a chunk of money when you're talking about a budget in Pennsylvania that's $43 billion. You have to get sort of a commitment in place to distribute those funds where they're needed the most, because it was the underfunded school districts that drove this conversation. But I think Sam's right. At some point, there's going to be a discussion. Republicans are going to demand at some point that, if we're going to be pouring more money into our school districts, we have to figure out a way to, put money in the hands of some students who maybe don't want to be there, maybe want to go to a different school. So where I think the education income tax credit program has been pretty successful, supported by Democrats. It's just a different sort of way to get to the voucher conversation without truly just handing, a voucher check off to a family. So I think there will be a big increase in EITC. I expect a fairly sizable increase in public education spending targeted at the districts that need it the most. And we know who they are. Those districts, they're the districts every year that are, low tax base, low performing. They don't do great test scores. So I think that's going to be the overriding debate for this entire cycle.
This maybe harkens back to our last caller, but Sam, do you think that money is the sole solution, or are there other policies perhaps that lawmakers want to see put into place to help our educational system?
I mean, absolutely. Money is not going to be the end all be all, right? I mean, and I think Republicans and Democrats agree on this. Funding is one piece of the answer, is one piece of the solution. But I think across the board in government and campaigns and everything, money probably gets a little bit overinflated. There are real issues that our schools face. I think the challenge for a state legislature is how much control you're going to take. To Mike's point earlier, we have 501 school districts, and we believe in local government control. So they elect their own boards. And this is what we saw the Pennsylvania School Board Association advocate during COVID, the idea that we should allow schools to decide their reopening plan, because a school in inner city Philadelphia may have a very different reality when it comes to how the percentages of COVID spread, the ability to do online school, the how many students are in their schools, than the schools, say, in the State College region or out in, Allegheny County. They're all going to be a little bit different. And so we're trying to give local districts this control, and yet at the same time, the state is providing so much of the funding. So the debate is always how much involvement the state has. But I think everybody agrees that just throwing money at it is not going to solve a problem. And when you talk about behavioral issues, or you talk about hiring issues, or you talk about structures, is admin too bloated in some of these schools? Do we need to invest more in teachers and maybe less in administrators? All of these questions are real practical questions, but they're not necessarily questions the state legislature can address or has the power authority to address. And I think that's where the big challenge comes in. Last thing I'll say is it's always easier to throw money at the problem than to actually sit down and solve it. The solving is the hard part. And I think that's another reason why I think the conversation always comes back to funding. And I think a lot of times you'll hear voters even say, hey, well, if we just had more money, we would solve this problem. But that's just not always the case. And I think Republicans and Democrats understand that.
If we're calling for more money, where does the more money come from?
Well, it's going to come from the taxpayers. I mean, the bottom line is it comes from the taxpayers. And I think, but I think Sam touched on a very important point. There are other things that you can be doing around school funding other than just handing more money to a district that can affect sort of the outcomes that you're trying to achieve for the students. The legislature has done a really good job in investing in, school mental health programs, school anti-violence programs. Shapiro was able to win, approval for one of his key promises, which was, free school breakfast for kids in schools. All of those things together contribute to a better learning environment, right? If you can go to school, you're not hungry, you're in a safe learning environment, you have access to sort of, the structure and the benefits of a strong mental health program in your school district, you're much more likely to have a better outcome as a student. So it may not just be throwing the money at the districts by formula. It might be doing some of those other things, whether it's investing more in, the teacher stipend program to try to lure more teachers to Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of ways you can get at the better education outcomes that don't necessarily cost, multiply, more money.
Now, we have a variety of policy issues and priorities that we're going to talk about this morning. However, keeping in mind the Senate returns to session in roughly 2 weeks, the House isn't scheduled to come into regular voting session until the middle of March because of some construction in the House chamber. How is that situation being received?
Yeah, it's... obviously the House is at 101 with a vacancy that special election will be held in February. And I think a lot of the Republicans thought that this, this roof leaking in the hall of the House was sort of a staged issue to try to dodge their responsibility. But what you've seen, I think, is, it's much ado about nothing. The House is moving aggressively forward with a lot of committee meetings. Just last week, the House Judiciary Committee kicked out 3 gun control proposals out of committee. And historically, between January and March, not a whole lot gets done in the Pennsylvania legislature. There haven't been any huge policy pieces that you can point to in the past decade or so that have been passed in, January of a year. So, I think they'll get back on track and they'll be back in March and they'll move fairly quickly, I believe.
We're going to give our guests a brief break and we will take your phone calls again in just a moment. But first, I'd like to tell you about some upcoming programming here on PCN. House Appropriations Chair Representative Jordan Harris is the featured speaker at this month's PA Press Club Luncheon. That's live today at 12:30 p.m., available to watch on cable or stream with PCN Select. Join us for a double dose of On the Issues this week as we discuss hate speech on campus with Senator Art Haywood, followed by a discussion about winter weather with Rob Leidick and Marissa Ferger of Weather World. That's Wednesday night, starting at 6. This Thursday, Journalist Roundtable features Carter Walker from VoteBeat, John Delano from KDKA, and Gillian McGoldrick with the Philadelphia Inquirer, Thursday night at 6. All of the great public affairs event coverage and interviews you watch at PCN are now available for free online at PCNTV.com and on PCN Select. And we're going to get back to our discussion. A reminder, our toll-free number is 1-877-PA6-5001. You can text us at 717-219-4001. Sam, we're going to come back to you. We're talking about how we have a divided legislature. The Republicans lead the Senate. The Democrats lead the House. Keeping in mind, they've been passing different policies and not necessarily one another's policies to bring them to agreement to the governor. Are there issues that come out as bargaining chips, perhaps, to move other initiatives forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the skill set of the legislative process where, are there bills that we can put forward and say, hey, if you vote for this, I'll give you a vote for that bill. And it all comes down to priorities. I think you may see the Reggie situation, Mike alluded to that earlier, as a potential bargaining chip. We even talked about the idea that it could be a bargaining chip or an opportunity for the governor. I think you could see school vouchers, that idea come back as a bargaining chip. Again, Republicans are looking at this saying, we've got the governor's support on this. Is there something that we can offer to the Democrats to get someone on board? The other thing to remember about this, and when it comes to bills that are being used as bargaining chips, is the majorities aren't large. It's a 6-vote majority in the Senate, if I remember correctly, which means 3 votes on the other way makes it split, and then the Lieutenant Governor Austin Davis breaks that tie, and well, right now it's dead even in the House, but it's traditionally been a one vote majority. And by the way, I just have to shout out the Pennsylvania State House. They have done more with the one vote majority, that one vote difference, than the U.S. House has been able to do all of last year with their slim margins. So well done to the State House. But that slim margin means that there's a lot of opportunity for compromise, and I expect we'll see some different issues come up as bargaining chips. You're probably not going to see it on big ticket items. Those are things, especially in election year, where you might see a little bit more partisanship. But if there's something small, that Mike used an analogy earlier of just getting on base, getting a base hit as opposed to a home run, that's the kind of stuff I expect we'll see.
Sam, Mike had mentioned a moment ago the House Judiciary Committee just moved 5 gun-related bills last week. During the fall session, they had passed at least 2 gun-related bills as well and sent those to the Senate. Is there any anticipation that the Senate will take any of these up?
I mean, the only reason I can see them taking it up is if the Republicans are confident that they can vote them down, and their members need that to go back to their districts in the election year. I don't see any of those bills becoming law. It moved out of the committee on the partisan vote, and so I expect to see that as kind of the way it's going to keep going, especially in an election year. I mean, you look at what the U.S. Congress did, and they finally were able to get somewhat of a compromise done. And those 10, 20 senators who did it, a lot of them aren't in office anymore. One of them was our former senator, Pat Toomey, and he's already announced that he's not running, and he's able to move on bills like this. Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, same story. He's not in office anymore. In an election cycle with everybody running for re-election, the gun issue is one of those issues that you're not going to move on. Party leadership is probably not going to move on unless they believe that it's a guaranteed win or a guaranteed loss, and their base needs that. That's the only time I can see a bill coming up, but I don't expect any of those pieces of legislation to become law this year.
Keeping that in mind, Mike, what does the House accomplish, particularly what do House Democrats accomplish by moving all of these gun-related bills if there's no expectation that the Senate's going to move them?
Well, I think the issue of gun violence is hugely important to the Democratic base. I don't think they could go through an entire session and not address something that is so critical for their voters, even knowing that it was probably not going to be moved in the Senate. And again, I think it's a statement of priorities that you make in a lot of cases. Going into an election year, you're going to see both chambers make those sort of statements of priorities and send things to the other chamber that aren't going to move, that aren't going to pass. And they know that ahead of time. The Democrats, I fully expect, will pass, more reproductive rights bills and send them to the Senate, knowing full well that the Senate's not going to move them, but it's all about sort of reminding their voters going into November that this is what we stand for. It's a statement of priorities. So, but in a lot of cases, I think you'll see less and less of that coming from the Senate Republicans. They're not traditionally, they're not looking to pick large public fights over, big public policy issues. They're much more of a, what they call the deliberative body, right? But Sam, I do have to agree with you. Matt Bradford, and the House Majority Leader, has done a masterful job of keeping his 102 members together, vote after vote after vote. And I remember, when I was Chief of Staff in the House, I remember being in the same position. We had a 1-vote majority. And it was amazing how, once everyone realizes that they can't be the outlier, how quickly everyone coalesces, even when they don't want to. So kudos to Matt Bradford for being able to hold his caucus together.
You just referenced the abortion issue. Today's coincidentally the 51st anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision. How has the issue of abortion kind of played out politically in Pennsylvania?
I think Roe v. Wade has been a disaster for Republicans at the ballot box. I think over and over again, it's proven to be effective for the Democratic Party. It's the overturning of Roe v. Wade is not popular, especially with suburban swing voters, and that's where Republicans used to have a lot of a stronger foothold in Pennsylvania, and they just don't have it anymore. And it's largely driven by issues like Roe. So I think, it has been a case where, the party has long advocated for this. They caught the car and, they ended up paying for it at the ballot box for several straight election cycles. I don't expect this one to be any different.
Sam, I'd like to get you to comment on this as well.
Yeah, I also think the other issue is that the Republicans haven't messaged it well or cohesively or as a unit. I think you watch any Republican primary debate, when the issue of abortion comes up, you've got 5 candidates. They may have 5 different answers, different approaches to it. And so there's a lot of Mike brought the point that everybody in the Republican Party, not everybody, but the Republican Party as a whole was really pushing for this. And they got that decision in Dobbs. And then suddenly you've got at least half the party trying to backtrack and trying to message differently. Maybe we don't want anything from the federal government. Maybe we only want something from the state government. Other Republicans say, no, we do want the federal government to go. There's a divide over what kind of exceptions they want, if they want exceptions at all. There's a divide over what is there legislation that's too extreme, or is there legislation that would be reasonable? And suddenly Republicans are all over the map messaging on this. There's been no cohesiveness to their message. I think that's also contributed to just the challenge they've had on the campaign trail with this, or with any of the bills that they have coming up. So I don't think they've done a very good job handling this issue at all. It certainly hurt them. And to Mike's point, I mean, you think about the demographic that hurts. The economy is going to be the leading issue if you are severely impacted by the economy. But in a lot of these suburban areas, they felt a little bit of the sting of the economy, but they're still going to their country club. They're still going out for their $15, $20 salad. That might be a little more expensive now. And so they're not as negatively impacted by it. So when they're sitting around that table talking with each other, the lead issue that affects them the most is going to be abortion. And so that's going to rise to the top of the issue list. I don't think it's something Republicans really understood in the last few cycles. And then their lack of cohesiveness on any kind of message has only made it worse. And so it's something that they're behind the 8 ball on. And if they want to pull those voters back, it's something they have to figure out.
Do you think this is solely a party line issue?
I mean, increasingly more so. It hasn't always been that way. I mean, I think one of the misnomers that a lot of people have is that Roe v. Wade was the law of the land until the Dobbs decision. It really was a case called Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which came right out of the state. And it's Bob Casey Sr., our senator's late father, who was notoriously a pro-life governor. And much to the chagrin of the Democratic National Party, but he was a pro-life governor. Senator Casey has had a little bit less now, but he used to be a lot more pro-life than he is now. And so you've seen that. Former Congressman Dan Lipinski, very well known as a Democrat, but a pro-life Democrat. And then you see pro-choice Republicans. My former boss, Charlie Dent, was a pro-choice Republican, voted for limitations to abortion, but would never support banning outright. But I think you see, I mean, most of those are formers now. They're no longer in office. And I think you see kind of the parties really just absorbing their respective sides. So I would say 10 years, even 5 years ago, this was less partisan of an issue than it is now. You had pro-choice Republicans and pro-life Democrats 10 years ago, and I think you see fewer and fewer of them now. They're still there, but they're a lot fewer in number.
I'd like to shift to a very different topic now, minimum wage. Early reports suggest the governor is going to call for an increase in the state's minimum wage. Just for a point of reference, how does Pennsylvania's minimum wage compare to that of neighboring states right now?
I think every one of our neighboring states has long since passed us with their minimum wages. In fact, every one of them has. I think it's become sort of Groundhog Day over and over again, where when is the right time to raise a minimum wage? The business community will tell you never, and they've been able to sort of hold the ramparts. But there's a deal to be made there, right? When we talk about this sort of deal making that goes on with legislatures and with governors, there are things the Republicans are going to want to see to help jumpstart the economy, and I think it's a perfect opportunity for Josh Shapiro to pull both parties in and say, fine, if these are the tax changes you want, these are the incentives you want, these are what's most important to you, whether that's net operating loss changes or single sales factor, whatever that happens to be, whatever the NFIB or chamber wish list is. If I were the Democratic governor, I'd say, well, you're going to pay a price for it, and that price is an increase in the minimum wage.
How do you determine what an appropriate level would be?
I think that's the challenge, right? I think Mike and I talked about this all show. The pragmatic side of it is probably the biggest challenge. If he raises it to $10, even $12, probably gets it's a little bit less angst on the Republican side if he couples it with some of those Republican priorities. Governor Shapiro ran on the idea that we have to keep our corporate taxes low. They're the second highest in the country right now. And so if he does something on that and he says, hey, by the way, I would like a $10 minimum wage or a $12 minimum wage, you may get more Republicans on board with that. You go up to 15 or higher, where some of the progressives want to go. I don't think cutting the corporate tax rate and coupling that with a $17, $20 minimum wage is going to get any Republicans on board. And so I think it's all the devil's in the details. It's all going to be about the pragmatic side of it. I think if he goes to 10, maybe the 12, he might get some Republicans depending on how much he gives them. I think if he goes beyond that, he's going to lose more and more Republicans.
Being that many jobs that traditionally would pay minimum wage are paying several dollars above that level right now, does the state's wage matter?
Well, it matters because the economy is not always going to be where it is today. There was a well-respected Republican leader who's no longer in office who decided to retire who once told me, the time to raise the minimum wage is when these companies are paying higher wages, so that when recessions hit, they can't just backtrack then and take you back to $7 an hour. While they're offering $15, $18, $20 an hour to work, wherever that used to be minimum wage jobs, it's not out of the realm of possibility that, an economic downturn hits that's so bad that they start slashing those wages. So there has to be some sort of a safety net to put in place. But there are Republicans, former Appropriations Chair Pat Brown had a bill every year to raise minimum wage. The aforementioned Dan Laughlin up in Erie has a bill to raise minimum wage. I think there's a recognition that it's the right thing to do, but then the question then becomes, as Sam and you spoke about, what's the level? What's the agreeable level? And they just haven't been able to have that discussion yet.
We'll come back to you, Sam. There have been several proposals, both sponsored by Republicans as well as Democrats, to legalize recreational marijuana in Pennsylvania. Do you think that sentiment has changed in the legislature over the years toward this issue?
Oh, absolutely. I think as time moves forward, more and more people are on board with it. I don't know that there's the votes yet, in order for it to get done yet, at least. But certainly, I think the attitude about it has shifted a bit. In fact, some of the leaders of the cannabis movement are Republicans. The initial legislation was brought forth by a former state senator who's a Republican, and so I think you're seeing some shifting attitudes about it. The cannabis issue is interesting because that's one that's not necessarily straight down party lines either. A lot of Democrats I speak to who are wary and they're cautious about legalizing cannabis. A lot of them see it as potentially a gateway. A lot of Republicans are supportive of it. Some of them see the fact that we're banning it as over government regulation, so a little bit more of a libertarian streak. So that's another issue where I don't know that it's purely partisan. I think there are Democrats who oppose it, Republicans who support it, and vice versa. But I do think you're going to get more and more support for it as time goes on. I'm not sure we have the votes in the chambers now to do it, but that could change in the next 5 years or so.
Marijuana is legal in New York and New Jersey and recently became legal in Maryland over the summer. Do you think that the surrounding states have an influence on our General Assembly's willingness to move this forward?
Well, if minimum wage is any indication, no. But I think, and also liquor laws. But, I think maybe while they may not have a direct impact on the thinking of the General Assembly in Pennsylvania, I do think that there is more of a recognition that we're losing a ton of revenue. We are unfairly incarcerating people of color in this state for marijuana charges that wouldn't even be a thing in any other state. So it's a criminal justice issue. It can be a huge boon to Pennsylvania's ag industry. The largest industry in Pennsylvania, agriculture. What this could do to the ag industry is beyond imagination. So I think there is enough support in the General Assembly to do it. It becomes a question of sort of things like tax rate. Will there be homegrown? Will there be expungement of criminal records that go along with it? So it's not just a question of, sort of clicking the button and saying, okay, it's illegal now. Everyone go, buy some weed. It's going to be, what's the regulatory regime look like around it? Who's going to be allowed to grow it? We have a very strict grower processor rule with medical marijuana in Pennsylvania that, coincidentally has tended to shut out sort of independent businesses and minority-owned businesses. So that's something will need corrected if we do legalize. But, there's a lot of other policy questions sort of swirl around that need to be solved as well.
Let's look at another long-delayed issue. The caucuses have been divided on a constitutional amendment that would allow the survivors of sexual abuse to sue their perpetrators. Do you see this moving anywhere?
It's wrapped around, the discussion we had earlier about voter ID. The Senate Republicans have sort of packaged that reform the window look back with voter ID, and have made it clear to the House they're not moving a simple sort of standalone sexual assault survivor package, constitutional amendment without voter ID. So I don't have great hopes that something happens unless sort of cooler heads prevail and get in a room. And, each side has been pretty, clear about their position, and they haven't really seemed to move much. So on the list of, likely things to happen, maybe I hope I'm wrong. I think because those survivors deserve it. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see much movement.
Sam, your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I agree with Mike on this one. I think that it's, to your point earlier about bargaining bills, this is one of them that the Senate is using as a bargaining chip. I just don't know that we're going to get movement on it. They're tying it to something they know that House Democrats don't love, the voter ID stuff. And so it's, I don't have high hopes that it moves. It's one of those things where I think if it was a standalone, you have some, pretty broad bipartisan support for. But the fact that it's not being run as a standalone right now is going to peel off a lot of members on it.
As we're considering the governor will be proposing his budget on February 6th, just give us a background. What does Pennsylvania's fiscal environment look like right now as we begin to consider state spending for next year?
I think we're on pretty firm financial footing right now. I mean, we put record amounts of money in the rainy day fund. The Independent Fiscal Office is showing, good revenue growth. I think we're probably in the best position we've been in since before 9/11. When we used to joke when Tom Ridge was governor that the only question the legislature had to solve every year was like how much to spend and where, because we always had surplus money laying around. That all changed after 9/11, and it's always been a fight over scarce resources. Since the waning days of the Wolf administration, that has not been the case in Pennsylvania, and they've been able to make some good targeted investments with the money and be fiscally responsible at the same time. I think, going back to when the Republicans held the chamber in the House, they were, pretty strong fiscal stewards, saying, we're going to spend a little bit, but we're going to put money away for a rainy day. And they've done that. Both chambers have done it. So I think, we could be in a whole heck of a lot worse shape in Pennsylvania than we are today.
Over the last few years, we've been also dealing with money that's been trickled down from the American Rescue Fund. What remains in Pennsylvania? What has to be spent now? And when does that all wrap up?
There's been some confusion, I think, on some of the money that went to DHS. So I'm not sure that's been ironed out yet as to when you lose the money, sort of spend it or lose it. But I think we're probably coming down to the end of most of the federal funding being here. There's a plan in place, but while we don't have all the money for, say, build out a broadband or electric vehicles, that money's sort of already been set aside, and there's a schedule to get it as long as you meet certain benchmarks. So I think we're sort of at the end of the ARPA dollars, but we've done a pretty good job as a Commonwealth in sort of not using that money on recurring expenses and not building that into the base spend for each subsequent year. So we're not going to be in the case, in some states have used it for recurring revenues, and they're going to be searching for solutions this year, whereas we're probably not going to be.
We are out of time. Mike Manzo, Sam Chen, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. PCN's Larry Kaspar spoke with Senator Katie Muth about safety for workers who do fracking at the natural gas industry.
Welcome, Senator. Can you give us a quick review of what's involved in the practice of fracking?
Sure. So hydraulic fracturing is the extraction of gas underneath rocks deep in the earth. And we use that extracted gas for an array of things, for energy purposes, for the production of plastics, for the production of chemicals. And though the process itself is very intensive and it requires millions and millions of gallons of fresh water, which is taken out of the waterways of our Commonwealth, to use to frack these well pads to extract the gas.
Now, I understand there is a great deal of water involved in fracking, but there's chemicals in addition to that, too. Can you tell us what is the condition of the water after it's been used for fracking? What's been added to it?
Sure. So a lot of the chemicals that are added are trade secret proprietary ingredients that each company within the oil and gas industry is allowed to, under law, keep them secret. But some are disclosed. Basic chemicals that go in, we're learning that are also containing PFOS and PFOA, which is incredibly worrisome in that these are being put into deep into the ground that has contact with our water table, which is our drinking water and groundwater. They also put in chemicals for lubrication, chemicals to break up the rock. But the other important thing is that comes up with this water that goes in with the chemicals is flowback, brine, produced water. There's an array of names that the industry uses. And this water is no longer usable and never can be ever again. It cannot be cleaned or stripped of the contaminants and harmful toxins that it contains, including radium. And we all know that Pennsylvania has a heavy radon footprint, but deep into the ground, there are radioactive materials that do come back up with the flowback or the produced water, and they are incredibly radioactively charged.
And Senator, on that subject, how much information do fracking workers have about these potential health hazards that they're coming in contact with?
It's a great question. I used to, before my district was redrawn, have Limerick Generating Station, which is a nuclear power plant in my district, and have gone on several tours. And the regulations for those workers, rightfully so, are very stringent. And despite the fact that the oil and gas industry has similar levels of radioactive components within its processes, waste, extraction, storage, that none of these workers are held to the same standard as if you would work in a nuclear power plant or in nuclear medicine. We all know imaging requires some level of nuclear activity to create MRIs and X-rays and things like that. And unfortunately, these workers, through loopholes in our laws, are not protected, nor are they informed about what they are working with on the daily and also bringing home to their families if they're in the waste hauling industry, between mud and things that get on their clothing that they bring back home.
And Senator, what would you like to do to improve the safety for workers involved in fracking?
I think step one is closing the loopholes within our law. The hazardous waste laws in Pennsylvania exempt the oil and gas industry from the same disposal requirements of any other industry that has nuclear waste in any form. And right now, Pennsylvania law allows for this waste to not only be dumped in landfills in our Commonwealth, also allows the leachate, the water, the condensate that comes out from these landfills to be discharged in sewage treatment facilities, where it actually is incredibly harmful in that it ends up eating the innards of the sewage treatment plant and no longer can filter out the components, which all of this is discharged back into the waterways of our Commonwealth. And so dilution is not the solution. We really need to actually classify this waste as hazardous, and therefore the workers would also be covered under better worker protections relative to nuclear exposure and hazardous waste exposure. Right now, like I said, none of them are, and become incredibly sick very quickly from not knowing how much and what exactly they're being exposed to.
Now, I understand, Senator, you've joined forces with an investigative reporter on this subject. And what has that reporter disclosed that you find most important? Try to tell us in about a minute.
Sure. So Public Herald has done a lot of reporting on this. The state's own data on radioactive components in landfills and waste treatment facilities shows that there is a high level of radioactive waste that's harmful to humans and workers in our environment. And its own data shows that it's not being cleaned, despite companies that say they can clean this water or this waste. And the levels are incredibly high. So they've, right to know the state, got information, and then met whistleblower workers that have been working in one of these facilities in Williamsport.
Now, last question, Senator. You've been working on this issue for a number of years, so I take it there's resistance out there from your colleagues. Why do you suppose that is?
Since the late 70s, the petrochemical oil and gas industry has known about these blatant harms and know that it will cost them a lot more money to actually do the right thing. Arguably, some people say that it can't even be done even with increased protections, but ultimately, the oil and gas and petrochemical industry in Pennsylvania is a love affair for both sides of the aisle. And people in our state don't even know that they're exposed to these risks on the daily. Doesn't matter if you live in frack land or near a frack pad. like I said, every landfill in Pennsylvania can legally take this radioactive waste.
Senator Katie Muth, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
That's it for today's show. Join us for tomorrow's episode of the PCN Capitol Preview. We'll be joined by chairs of the House Education Committee, Representatives Peter Schweier and Jesse Topper, who will discuss school funding, including the recent report released by the Basic Education Funding Commission. That's tomorrow live at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.